The morning sun had barely crested the rooftops of Willow Bend when Cornell Banning's life changed forever. He was halfway home from a routine supply run. A bag of tools on the passenger seat, a cup of coffee still steaming in the holder, when he noticed something strange on the horizon. 3 figures in neon vests were scattered across the edge of his land, hammering metal stakes into the ground he'd known since childhood. It was a patch of Texas soil his grandfather had bought after World War II, a single acre fenced with rusting wire and shaded by stubborn mesquite trees. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't profitable, but it was home. Cornell slowed his truck and pulled over to the side of the gravel road. At first, he thought maybe they were city surveyors or utility workers who'd gotten the wrong address. But then he saw the white pickup parked near the property line. Its tailgate open, blueprints spread across the bed like a conquest map, and standing beside those plans, in heels that didn't belong anywhere near dirt, was a woman in a tailored beige blazer barking orders as if the ground itself obeyed her. He stepped out, his boots crunching against the shoulder. "Excuse me," he called, his voice steady but firm. "What exactly are you doing on my land?" The woman didn't flinch. She turned toward him with the subtle annoyance of someone being interrupted mid-task, her chin tilted upward, expensive sunglasses hiding any trace of emotion. "We're assessing it," she said flatly, as though the answer were obvious. "For development." Cornell blinked. "This is Banning property. Has been for 3 generations." Her lips curved into a polite but dismissive smile. "Newsed property," she corrected, flicking a hand toward the workers. "And this project will raise property values for everyone in Willow Bend." No one had asked him. No one had called. And yet here they were. Strangers hammering into the land his grandfather had plowed with his own hands. Cornell's jaw tightened. "You don't set foot on a man's land without permission," he said quietly. She stepped closer, the crunch of gravel beneath her expensive heels the only sound in the still air. "Mr. Banning, isn't it? I'm Judith Merrow, president of the Willow Bend HOA. This is about progress. About making this neighborhood into what it was always meant to be." Progress. The word hung between them, bitter and heavy. He looked out at the acre, dry earth, stubborn trees, a fence sagging under the weight of decades, and felt his grandfather's presence like a ghost at his shoulder. Elijah Banning had bought this land in 1947, a time when men like him were told where they could and couldn't live, when ownership was a dream often denied. He had worked 2 factory jobs, saved every dime, and bought this acre outright. No bank, no mortgage, just sweat and determination. Cornell still remembered walking it as a boy, his grandfather's weathered hand resting on his shoulder. "They ain't making more dirt, boy," Elijah used to say. "You guard it, you honor it." And now this woman, this self-appointed arbiter of progress, was treating it like a blank slate. Judith's smile didn't waver. "History doesn't pay the bills, Mr. Banning," she said smoothly. "And frankly, this land is an eyesore. We're correcting that." Something in him wanted to shout, to call the sheriff right there and then. But he didn't. Instead, he turned back toward his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He could have filed a complaint that day, could have dragged the HOA into court, but a voice deeper than anger told him to wait, to watch, to let her believe she was in control. And so he did. Weeks turned into months, and the assessment became something far more invasive. Survey stakes became concrete markers. Rumors spread through the neighborhood about a transformational, new project, a Mediterranean-style villa, something that would elevate the entire area. Judith spoke about it at HOA meetings with the zeal of a preacher, showing glossy renderings and architectural plans. "It will be the crown jewel of Willow Bend," she promised. A symbol of progress. Cornell stayed silent. He paid his property taxes, parked his truck at the edge of the lot some evenings, and watched as strangers trampled across the soil his grandfather had bled for. They saw nothing but empty space. He saw legacy. He saw memory. And beneath the growing frustration, a plan began to form. When the bulldozers arrived, the neighborhood buzzed with excitement. "Finally someone's doing something with that land," they said. "It's about time." Cornell didn't correct them. He simply watched as the first chunks of earth were carved away, as rebar was laid, as foundations were poured. Judith strutted across the construction site in tailored suits and pearl earrings, giving interviews to local magazines. "This is about vision," she declared, "about setting a standard for what Willow Bend can be." To investors, she promised prestige and visibility. To neighbors, she sold the dream of rising property values, and to herself, she whispered something more personal: legacy. This was her chance to be remembered. Cornell never confronted her. He never stormed onto the property or shouted at the workers. Instead, he took photos, he timestamped videos, he collected copies of permits and invoices, and every night, he returned home and filed them neatly into a folder labeled, "Banning Land." The deeper she dug, the more certain he became. This wasn't a fight he'd win with fists or fury. It was one he'd win with patience. Because every nail, every brick, every chandelier, they weren't hers, they were being built on his soil. And when the time came, the law would see it that way too. Judith mistook his silence for defeat. She mistook his patience for powerlessness. And that was her mistake. By spring, the skeleton of the villa rose proudly from the ground. Imported stone from Italy, archways inspired by Spanish estates, a reflecting pool that caught the Texas sun. To the untrained eye it was a masterpiece in the making. To Cornell, it was arrogance cast in concrete. At a block party, he overheard neighbors speculating about the home's worth. $6 million, maybe more. Can you imagine the parties? One woman said. Finally, that land will have some use. Cornell clenched his jaw but said nothing. He didn't need their approval. He didn't need their belief. He had the one thing that mattered, a piece of paper tucked safely in a fireproof box, signed by his grandfather in 1947. And when the time was right, that paper would speak louder than any foundation ever could, because Judith Marrow might have been building a mansion. But Cornell Banning? He was building a reckoning. The sound reached him before the sight did, a deep, rhythmic thud that made the ground tremble beneath his boots. Cornell turned onto Willow Bend Drive one crisp autumn morning and felt his stomach knot. There, behind bright orange fencing and towering piles of rebar, a backhoe was clawing into the soil his grandfather once walked with a shovel over his shoulder. It wasn't surveying anymore. This was full-scale construction. Concrete trucks lined the street, engines humming. Workers shouted over the roar of machinery. Wooden frames outlined what would soon be the villa's walls. It was no longer theoretical. Judith's dream had broken ground. Cornell parked across the street and climbed out, each step toward the site heavier than the last. A foreman waved him back. Sir, you can't be here. Construction zone. He ignored the warning. Who gave you permission to build on this land? The man hesitated, glancing nervously toward a sleek black SUV that had just pulled up. Judith stepped out, dressed as if she were attending a board meeting instead of a construction site. Pressed slacks, crisp white blouse, sunglasses shielding her expression. Good morning, Cornell, she said with disarming politeness, as if they were old friends running into each other at the grocery store. What the hell do you think you're doing? He asked, voice low but trembling with rage. This is my family's property. Judith sighed like a teacher correcting a stubborn student. I've explained this. This project benefits the entire neighborhood. Jobs, investment, rising property values. Do you really want to hold back progress over some sentimental attachment to weeds and wire fences? His fists clenched at his sides. You're trespassing. This isn't weeds, this is banning land. You don't erase history because it doesn't fit your brochure. A few workers stopped pretending to work, watching the confrontation. Judith leaned in slightly, perfume cutting through the dust. Then sue me, she whispered. But by the time the courts finish, this villa will be standing, and once people see it, no one will care whose name is on some piece of paper. Cornell stared at her, fury simmering beneath the surface. You're building a castle on quicksand, Judith. Funny. She smirked. It looks like solid ground to me. Her arrogance hit him harder than any insult. It was more than disrespect. It was a declaration of war. But instead of shouting, Cornell turned and walked back to his truck. The silence unnerved her more than anger would have. Later that evening, he stood at the edge of the property again. Wooden forms were in place, marking the footprint of the villa. The outlines of future walls sliced through the soil like scars. His phone buzzed. It was his cousin Jerome. You seeing this mess? Jerome asked. I'm looking at it right now. Cornell said quietly. That woman's insane. You gonna stop her? Not yet. Cornell replied. Not yet. She's stealing your land, man. Cornell's grip tightened around the phone. Sometimes the best way to beat someone is to let them think they've already won. Every brick she lays just makes my case stronger. It was easier said than done. Each morning, the structure grew higher. Steel beams rose, walls took shape, delivery trucks brought crates of imported stone. Neighbors started speculating openly. I heard it's going to be worth $6 million. Can you imagine the view from that terrace? Finally someone's improving that eyesore. The Cornell said nothing. But every evening, he documented the progress. He photographed shipments, recorded the noise, noted every change. It was all evidence, a record of her arrogance written in concrete and steel. Judith, meanwhile, was basking in her self-made glory. She toured the site daily, shaking hands with investors and praising workers. She hosted walkthroughs for potential buyers and boasted to anyone who would listen that this villa would redefine Willow Bend. To her, Cornell was irrelevant, an obstacle already removed from her path, but she didn't understand the ground she was walking on. She didn't understand that every inch of tile, every chandelier flown in from Italy, every imported column belonged to the soil beneath it, and that soil wasn't hers. Weeks turned into months. The villa rose from the earth like a monument to unchecked ambition, and yet Cornell remained silent. Neighbors started to wonder if he'd given up, if he'd sold the land quietly or lacked the will to fight. But in truth he was sharpening his blade. One afternoon, he drove into Dallas to meet his attorney, Paul Richter, a family friend with 30 years of property law under his belt. Cornell laid the deed on Paul's desk, yellowed with age, embossed with county seals, bearing his grandfather's signature. Paul read it twice before leaning back in his chair. "This is airtight. The land's been in your family for decades. You've got a chain of ownership clear as day. So if I take her to court I'll win?" Cornell asked. "You'll win," Paul said, "but it might take months, maybe years. If she fights it'll get messy. And if the house is finished by then, things get complicated." "Complicated how?" "Technically, once a structure is built on land, it belongs to the landowner. That's you. But she might countersue, claim damages, drag the case out. It'll cost time and money." Cornell nodded slowly. "Then I wait." Paul raised an eyebrow. "You're going to let her finish it? Every dollar she spends, every brick she lays, it's mine the moment the dust settles," Cornell said. Paul gave a low whistle. "Cold-blooded, patient," Cornell corrected, "and so, he waited. He drove past the site daily, taking pictures from the road. He timestamped each one, archived them carefully. He collected copies of permits, invoices, even discarded packaging from imported materials. Each item was a building block in a legal fortress he was constructing quietly, methodically. Sometimes, the anger threatened to overwhelm him. At a gas station one evening, he overheard two construction workers laughing. "Can you believe the HOA president just grabbed the land like that?" one said. "Bold move. Bold." Cornell muttered to himself as he walked away. "Try theft." But still he held his tongue. Judith's arrogance only grew. She hosted tours for donors while the house was still beams and scaffolding. "Here's the grand hall," she said one Saturday, gesturing at unfinished walls. "Double staircase. Custom railings from Italy. Picture it, this will redefine Plano." Cornell stood just beyond the temporary fence, arms crossed. For a moment, their eyes met. Her smile faltered, but she turned back to her audience. He tipped his hat, a silent challenge, "Keep going," and she did. The villa climbed higher. Roof tiles glistened in the Texas sun. Chandeliers arrived in crates stamped AGL. Landscaping crews began planting manicured hedges. Judith strutted across the site like a monarch inspecting her palace. Neighbors whispered that Cornell had surrendered. Some called him weak, others said he'd been outplayed. None of them knew the truth. He wasn't losing, he was watching, he was waiting. And when the time came, when the final brick was laid and the last chandelier hung, Judith Merrow would learn that arrogance has a price. And she'd written the check herself. By the time spring rolled into summer, the acre of earth Cornell had known since childhood was almost unrecognizable. Where there had once been nothing but sun-bleached soil and a sagging wire fence, now stood towering walls, arched windows, and marble columns imported from overseas. A driveway curved elegantly up to what would soon become a grand entrance, and a reflecting pool sparkled under the Texas sun. Judith Merrow walked the site daily with the self-assured air of a queen inspecting her palace. Investors trailed behind her like courtiers, nodding at every word she spoke. "This will be the crown jewel of Willow Bend," she declared during one tour. "A $6 million masterpiece that will put this neighborhood on the map." Cornell stood across the street that day, arms folded over his chest, watching silently from the shade of a mesquite tree. To anyone passing by he looked defeated. A man who had lost the battle before it began. But inside his patience was sharpening into something stronger than rage. At a barbecue joint a few miles away, Jerome still struggled to understand it. "Man, I don't get how you can just watch her steal from you," he said between bites of brisket. "If it were me, I'd have chained myself to a bulldozer weeks ago." Cornell cut his brisket slowly, deliberately. "Let her build," he said simply. Jerome scoffed. "She's showing off, acting like it's hers." "That's the point," Cornell replied, setting his fork down. "Every imported brick, every chandelier, every square foot of polished stone, it's all being planted in my soil. She doesn't see it now, but she's decorating my house for me." Jerome leaned back, a whistle escaping his lips. "That's cold, man." "Fair," Cornell corrected. "My grandfather didn't break his back so someone could erase our name from this land. If she wants to play queen, fine. But the crown sits on my dirt." Judith's ambitions were no longer confined to the neighborhood. She arranged for a feature in a Dallas real estate magazine, presenting the villa as a visionary transformation project. On camera she stood before the half-finished mansion declaring, "This is about setting a standard. Plano deserves elegance. This property will symbolize progress." When a reporter asked about ownership, Judith laughed lightly. "Technicalities," she said. "What matters is vision." Cornell watched the interview from his living room, shaking his head. Her arrogance would be her undoing. She had convinced herself that possession was the same as ownership, that money outweighed the law. But the deeper she buried herself in that belief, the harder her fall would be. As the villa neared completion, the neighborhood buzzed with excitement. Landscaping crews planted olive trees and manicured hedges. Trucks delivered chandeliers the size of small cars. Judith hosted elegant preview events inside the unfinished home. Champagne and crystal flutes, hors d'oeuvres served on silver trays, inviting business leaders, city officials, and lifestyle bloggers. Picture it, she told them, gesturing grandly. A landmark property. This villa will redefine Willow Bend and bring in the kind of residents we deserve. A city council member nodded politely. But a lifestyle blogger pressed further. And the land? She asked. I've heard there's been some dispute. Judith's smile tightened but didn't crack. A minor technicality, she replied. Once the villa is complete, the matter will be resolved in my favor. It always is. Cornell watched from the sidewalk, arms crossed as laughter and clinking glasses echoed into the night. To them, Judith was a visionary. To him, she was a fool building her own gallows. As word of the confrontation spread, the neighborhood divided. Some residents idolized Judith, calling her bold and unstoppable. Others whispered that she had crossed a line, yet no one spoke loud enough to matter. Cornell became a ghost in his own story, silent, watchful, enduring. But beneath that silence a storm was building. By midsummer, the house was nearly finished. Roof tiles gleamed like copper beneath the scorching sun. A custom-made door from Spain was being fitted to the grand entrance. The air around Willow Bend was thick with anticipation and tension. Cornell's patience had carried him far. But now, standing across from the finished driveway, watching palm trees being planted in soil that had once grown mesquite and wildflowers, he felt something inside him shift. Judith noticed him that afternoon. She strode across the newly paved driveway with a glass of sparkling water in hand, wearing the smug smile of a woman who believed she'd already won. Well, if it isn't the silent observer, she said coolly. I was beginning to think you'd given up. Given up on my land? Cornell asked, stepping out of his truck. Never. She tilted her head, smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. You keep saying that. And yet, here we are, almost done. $6 million of progress standing right here while you sit in your truck taking pictures. You can lay gold on this soil, Judith, Cornell said evenly, but the deed's still in my name. She laughed, sharp and dismissive. Paperwork. Do you know how many loopholes there are in this state? Lawyers can argue for years. By the time anything's settled, I'll have lived in this house long enough to call it mine. Cornell stepped closer, his voice dropping low. You think money gives you ownership. You think arrogance makes you untouchable. My grandfather taught me something: land doesn't forget its owner. And this land doesn't belong to you. Workers nearby paused, their shovels hanging mid-air as they watched. Judith's smile stiffened, but she didn't back down. Then stop me, she challenged. Call your lawyer. File your papers. I dare you. Not yet, Cornell said, the words quiet but heavy. The calm in his voice rattled her more than any threat could. She stepped back, annoyed. Enjoy your little fantasy, she said. Because soon the entire neighborhood will see what progress looks like, and you'll just be the man who couldn't keep up. Cornell didn't respond. He turned and walked back to his truck, his silence cutting deeper than any insult. That night, word of their confrontation spread quickly. Some neighbors sided with Judith, praising her vision. Others quietly rooted for Cornell, sensing that his calm was not defeat but calculation. Even Gerald, the thin man who once questioned Judith's plan, muttered to his wife, I don't think Banning's beaten. He's too calm. Too sure. But Judith didn't slow down. If anything, she doubled her efforts. She hosted an extravagant preview event inside the half-finished villa, inviting city officials, local business leaders, and even media figures. Champagne flowed freely, classical music played softly in the background, and Judith, in a glittering silver dress, floated through the grand foyer as if she already owned it. This villa will raise property values across Willow Bend, she boasted. It will bring in wealth, prestige, and influence. It will redefine what this neighborhood stands for. Outside, Cornell watched from the sidewalk, the glow of chandelier light spilling across the pavement. To the guests inside, Judith was a visionary leader. To Cornell, she was a woman digging her own grave, and every toast, every compliment, was another shovelful of dirt. Soon, the moment he'd been waiting for would arrive. And when it did, the story Judith had written for herself, the one about power, progress, and legacy, would crumble in the face of a single truth. The land beneath it all had never been hers. The night of Judith Merrow's grand unveiling arrived like the opening act of a Broadway play. Floodlights bathed the $6 million villa in golden light. A red carpet stretched from the street to the towering double doors, and luxury SUVs lined the driveway in a procession of wealth and influence. The mansion glowed like a monument to ambition, and Judith, dressed in silver silk and diamond earrings, floated from guest to guest, her smile a carefully rehearsed performance. "This is what vision looks like," she said to a small circle of donors, raising a glass of champagne. "This is what progress means." Inside, the marble floors gleamed under imported chandeliers. Venetian mirrors lined the grand foyer. Waiters in crisp white shirts carried trays of hors d'oeuvres through rooms that had cost more to furnish than most houses in the neighborhood. Guests murmured in awe. "Judith really outdid herself." One whispered. "This will change everything," said another, and across the street, sitting silently in his old pickup truck, Cornell Banning watched the spectacle unfold. He wasn't wearing a suit or tie, just jeans, boots and a button-down shirt. But he wasn't there to fit in, he wasn't there to celebrate. Tonight wasn't about appearances, it was about truth. He stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, and walked slowly up the driveway. Heads turned as he approached, conversations faltered, and Judith's confident smile wavered for just a fraction of a second before she composed herself. "Well," she said loudly, her voice echoing through the foyer. "Look who's decided to join us. Mr. Banning, welcome. Come to finally see progress up close." Cornell didn't answer. His eyes swept the room, the chandeliers, the polished marble, the crowd sipping champagne, before settling on Judith. Then, without a word, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, thick with age and marked with official county seals. "I didn't come to see progress," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I came to remind you who this land belongs to." The room fell silent. He unfolded the paper slowly, deliberately, and held it high for all to see. "Elijah Banning purchased this acre in 1947, he passed it to his son, and now it sits in my name, legally, rightfully. Every brick, every tile, every chandelier in this house stands on my soil, which makes it mine." Gasps rippled through the crowd, a woman covered her mouth. A man whispered, "He owns it." Phones emerged, recording every second. Judith's face tightened, but she forced a laugh. "This is a stunt," she said dismissively. "A pathetic stunt. You can wave old papers around all night, Cornell, but this house is mine. Everyone here knows it. You can argue in front of your guests," Cornell said, stepping closer. "But the county clerk's office won't call it a stunt. The title's in my name. The deed's on record. Every dollar you poured into this place, every favor you called in, all of it landed in my pocket the moment you laid a foundation." A murmur swept through the room. "If that's true," a businessman muttered to his wife, "she's ruined." Judith's mask began to crack. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "You think you can walk in here, in front of my guests, and humiliate me? You did that yourself," Cornell replied evenly. "The moment you decided my family's history was disposable." The silence was suffocating. Judith's hand tightened around her champagne glass until it snapped in her grip, shards glittering on the marble floor. Cornell folded the deed and slipped it back into his pocket. He turned toward the door, but before stepping out, he looked back at the stunned crowd. "Remember this night," he said quietly. "Not as the celebration of a mansion, but as the lesson of what happens when pride outruns respect." And with that, he walked out. Behind him, the gala collapsed into chaos. Guests exchanged anxious glances and whispered excuses as they slipped out the door. Investors who had once smiled at Judith now avoided her gaze. A Dallas developer muttered into his phone, "Pull out. We're done." Even the city council member, who had posed for pictures with Judith hours earlier, left without a word. Judith stood alone in the grand foyer, the weight of humiliation pressing down on her like the marble columns she had so proudly installed. The house she had built to symbolize power and prestige had become the stage for her downfall. And it wasn't even hers. The fallout was swift and brutal. By morning, videos of Cornell's quiet takedown were trending online. Neighbors had filmed the confrontation from multiple angles, and the clips spread across social media like wildfire. Local news stations ran the footage on repeat. HOA president builds $6 million mansion on land she doesn't own. Read one headline. Modern day cautionary tale of arrogance and property law. Declared another. Cornell woke to a phone buzzing with messages. Reporters asking for interviews, relatives calling to congratulate him, neighbors apologizing for doubting him. But he ignored most of it. This had never been about fame or money. It had been about respect. Judith, on the other hand, vanished. The woman who once thrived on attention drew her curtains, stopped answering calls, and cancelled every public appearance. But silence couldn't shield her from the consequences. Investors demanded refunds and explanations. Contractors, many of whom still hadn't been paid in full, stopped showing up. A Dallas magazine quietly removed its feature on the villa, replacing it with an editor's note citing legal complications. Even the city, embarrassed by the debacle, opened an investigation into zoning violations and misrepresentations. The neighborhood, too, turned against her. At an emergency HOA meeting, residents who once trembled under Judith's authority lined up to speak against her. "You abused your power," one woman said. "You treated our neighborhood like your personal empire." When the vote came, it was unanimous. Judith Merrow was removed as HOA president, effective immediately. The news hit her harder than she expected. For years, she had defined herself by control. By the way people looked at her when she spoke, by the power she wielded over the smallest details of their lives. Now, stripped of her title and exposed for her arrogance, she was left with nothing but an unfinished dream and a house she could never claim. Cornell didn't celebrate. He drove out to the property one evening after the decision and walked the perimeter slowly. The villa stood dark and silent under the moonlight, its marble columns casting long shadows across the ground. He paused near the reflecting pool and felt a strange mix of triumph and sadness. So much money, so much effort, all wasted because one woman had refused to understand a simple truth: land isn't just dirt, it's memory, it's legacy, it's law. "Granddad," he whispered into the quiet night, "we kept it. She tried, but we kept it." For a long moment, he stood there, breathing in the scent of mesquite and concrete, history and hubris colliding in the still air, and then he turned and walked away, leaving Judith's empty palace standing as a monument, not to her power, but to her downfall. But while the neighborhood was settling into its new reality, the rest of the world wasn't done with the story yet. Reporters, lawyers, curious strangers, the story was far from over. And its ripples would spread far beyond Willow Bend. The weeks that followed transformed Willow Bend into the epicenter of a nationwide debate. What had begun as a neighborhood scandal quickly exploded into something far bigger. Local news gave way to state coverage, and soon national outlets ran sensational headlines. "Man lets President build dream mansion, then claims it as his own. 6 million lesson why arrogance and entitlement always los." Talk shows dissected the story, legal analysts debated the finer points of property law, and online forums filled with fiery arguments. Some called Cornell a genius, a master strategist who had outplayed his adversary with patience and precision. Others accused him of cruelty, insisting he should have stopped Judith before she wasted millions. Cornell didn't engage in the noise. He knew people would see what they wanted to see. For him, it was never about revenge, it was about something deeper. About defending the legacy his grandfather had built with sweat and sacrifice. About making sure that no one could ever erase his family's name from the soil they had claimed. Judith, once the unchallenged queen of Willow Bend, was now a ghost, curtains drawn, driveway empty. Her name was spoken only in hushed tones, usually followed by a shake of the head. Investors filed lawsuits, contractors demanded damages, and even the city considered legal action for false statements and zoning violations. The empire she had tried to build collapsed piece by piece, leaving behind nothing but debts and disgrace. Cornell remained largely out of the public eye. He gave a single interview to a local newspaper, sitting across from a young reporter in a quiet diner. "What does it feel like," she asked, "to own a $6 million home you didn't spend a dime building?" He sipped his coffee before answering. "Heavy," he said simply. "Because it's not about the house. It's about respect. My grandfather worked his whole life for that acre." She tried to erase him. "I couldn't let that happen." "And what will you do with the property now?" she pressed. He shrugged. "I haven't decided yet. But one thing's certain, it's mine. It always has been." In the weeks that followed, speculation ran wild. Some neighbors believed Cornell would sell the property and walk away with millions. Others thought he might demolish the villa out of principle. But Cornell wasn't in a hurry. He visited the property often, walking slowly along its perimeter, letting his boots trace the same paths his grandfather once walked. The land had waited for decades. It could wait a little longer. One quiet Sunday afternoon, he stood by the reflecting pool, watching the sunlight ripple across its surface. He could still hear his grandfather's voice in his mind. "Dirt's the one thing they ain't making more of, boy. You guard it, you honor it." He realized then that the real inheritance wasn't the house. It was the lesson Judith had unknowingly handed him and the world. A reminder that arrogance blinds, that power without respect always collapses, and that patience, though often painful, is the sharpest weapon of all. Back in the neighborhood, the villa became a cautionary tale. Parents told the story to their children as a lesson in humility. HOA boards across the country referenced the case as a warning about overreach. Real estate law professors added it to their lectures. The house that was meant to symbolize Judith's triumph had instead become a monument to her downfall. And a testament to the quiet power of patience and principle. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal in Willow Bend. New HOA leadership was elected, this time with a pledge to listen to residents rather than dictate to them. Neighbors who had once sided with Judith, now greeted Cornell with warm smiles and nods of respect. Some even apologized for doubting him. He accepted their words graciously, but he didn't dwell on them. His focus was on the future, and on ensuring that the legacy of the Banning family would endure for generations to come. One evening, Jerome joined him on the property as the sun dipped low on the horizon. The villa stood tall and silent, its walls bathed in the orange glow of twilight. So Jerome said, shoving his hands into his pockets, "What now, you gonna move in?" Cornell chuckled softly, "Maybe, maybe not. It's not really about that." "Then what's it about?" "About proving something," Cornell replied, "not to her, to myself. That some things are worth protecting, that legacy matters more than ego. That respect means more than money." Jerome nodded slowly. "You know, a lot of folks would have sold out a long time ago." "Maybe," Cornell said. "But they don't have Elijah Banning's blood in their veins." The two men stood in silence for a while, listening to the soft rustle of leaves in the warm evening breeze. Finally, Jerome broke the quiet. "You think she learned anything from all this?" Cornell looked out over the property, his gaze steady and calm. "I hope so," he said, "because the truth is I never wanted her destroyed, I just wanted her to understand. To see that there are some lines you don't cross. Some histories you don't erase. Think she gets it now?" A small smile tugged at the corner of Cornell's mouth. "I think losing everything has a way of teaching lessons you'd never learn any other way." And perhaps Judith had learned. She sold her house and moved away quietly, disappearing from public life entirely. No farewell speeches, no statements, just silence, the kind of silence that comes when pride finally runs out of words. Cornell never saw her again, but sometimes when he walked the property at dusk he thought about her, not with anger, but with a strange, distant pity, because he understood now that her downfall wasn't really about property or law or even arrogance. It was about blindness. Judith had been so consumed by her need to control, to build, to be remembered, that she'd forgotten the one truth that had guided the Banning family for generations: the land remembers its owner. And the land had remembered. Years later, people would still tell the story. New homeowners would stand at the edge of the villa's driveway, and listen to neighbors recount the saga of Judith Marrow and Cornell Banning. They would shake their heads in disbelief and laugh at the audacity of it all. But beneath the humor, they would feel the weight of the lesson. A lesson about patience, about principle, about the quiet strength of legacy. Cornell never sought fame, but the story made him something of a legend in his own right. He was the man who had waited, the man who had turned arrogance into ashes, the man who had reminded an entire neighborhood, and perhaps a nation, that some things cannot be bought or bulldozed. And as the sun set over Willow Bend one evening, casting long shadows across the villa that now stood silent and still, Cornell smiled. Because he knew the truth, a truth his grandfather had taught him long ago, one that Judith had learned the hard way: pride fades. Houses crumble, but land, and the respect you show it, endures forever.